This video covers your Chapter 9 notes, which is cellular respiration. So that's our focus, and here are all the things, plus some more, that you will need to know about cellular respiration. We'll start off with an overview. During cell respiration, organisms use organic molecules and oxygen from photosynthesis to generate ATP. CO2 and H2O are also generated during this process. The overall equation for respiration is C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus ATP. It occurs in 3 steps. The first one is glycolysis, which occurs in the cytoplasm, and glucose is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which can also be called pyruvic acid. The second step, which happens in the mitochondria, is called the Krebs cycle and also called the citric acid cycle. During that step, the organism completes the breakdown of glucose. The third and final step is oxidative phosphorylation, which also occurs in the mitochondria, and that's where most of the ATP synthesis occurs. The goal of cell respiration is to make ATP. Everything else is a byproduct. These are catabolic pathways that release stored energy by breaking down complex molecules. Electron transfer plays a major role in this process, and our 2 electron carriers for cell respiration are NAD+ and FADH. So this is an overall diagram of cell respiration. We have glycolysis, which goes into the citric acid cycle, and then finally we have oxidative phosphorylation. This diagram shows the connections between photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis produces organic molecules in O2 that are then used for cell respiration, which produce CO2 and H2O that are again used for photosynthesis. So for plants, it's a little easier. They make it and then use it. But for all other organisms that do not make their own food via photosynthesis, they have to breathe in to get the O2 and consume food, or in the case of fungi, absorb things from the environment to get those organic molecules for respiration. All organisms complete some form of cell respiration. If they're doing aerobic respiration, they consume organic molecules and O2 to make ATP. So when we think about cell respiration, that's the process we're thinking about it, and we do need mitochondria for this. So this is a eukaryotic organism things. Or they will do fermentation, which can break down sugars without using oxygen, or mitochondria might not be necessary. And that's when we'll get into talking about lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation a little bit later. Anaerobic respiration is similar to aerobic, but it consumes compounds other than O2. Let's start by focusing on glycolysis, which is the first step of cell respiration. Again, this occurs in the cytoplasm, and it will happen before aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Glycolysis literally means sugar splitting, and that molecule of glucose will be broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate or pyruvic acid, and oxygen is not required for this process. And again, it happens first, even if anaerobic respiration or fermentation follows. So this is what's really happening. We start breaking down glucose. We use 2 ATP, and then later we'll make 4. So that gives us a net gain of 2 ATP from this process. And through the splitting of that glucose molecule into pyruvate, we will have some free electrons that will be attached to an NAD+ molecule to make NADH. So we'll have some of that. So overall, we have glucose being converted into pyruvate. We are going to make 4 ATP, but use 2 to have a net gain of 2 ATP, and then we'll make a little bit of NADH during the process. Next is the citric acid cycle. If there is oxygen present, this will occur after glycolysis. This process finishes the breakdown of glucose, or it's really pyruvate, into CO2. It generates ATP, NADH, and FADH2 each time the cycle goes through. This process occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. Before the citric acid cycle can happen, pyruvate must be converted into acetyl coenzyme A, which we call acetyl-CoA, before it can begin. And there are 3 steps to the reaction. We have the oxidation of pyruvate and release of CO2, the reduction of NAD plus to NADH, and then we have a combination of the remaining 2 carbon fragment and coenzyme A to form acetyl-CoA. So this is the conversion of pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. The citric acid cycle has 8 steps that are each catalyzed by a specific enzyme. The acetyl group of acetyl-CoA joins the cycle by combining with oxalacetoate to form citrate. The next 7 steps decompose the citrate back into what it was before. And this process produces a lot of NADH and FADH2 that will eventually move on to the 3rd step of respiration. So this is a general diagram of the citric acid cycle. We can see we have a little bit of ATP production. We're generating some NADH and FADH2, and we will have a release of CO2. This is the in-depth diagram. I'm not expecting you to have this memorized, but know what is, what's being generated, converted, and released. Oxidative phosphorylation follows glycolysis in the citric acid cycle when O2 is present. It is going to use NADH that's been generated during glycolysis in the citric acid cycle and FADH2 from the citric acid cycle and O2. It can make about 32 ATP. The electron carriers donate electrons to the electron transport chain, which powers ATP synthesis via oxidative phosphorylation. This process occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. The electron transport chain is composed mostly of proteins. Electrons drop in free energy as they go down the chain and are given to O2, which is the final electron acceptor, to form H2O. The electrons are transferred from NADH and FADH2 to the electron transport chain, which you can see here. So they go through those series of proteins, and then eventually we have the formation of water. Next, we'll talk about chemiosmosis. The energy released as electrons are passed down the ETC is used to pump H+ from the matrix to the inner membrane space. H+ moves down the concentration gradient back across the membrane, passing through ATP synthase. And those H+ moves into binding sites on the rotor of ATP synthase, which in turn turns ADP into ATP, which you can see here and also here. So oxidative phosphorylation is ETC followed by chemiosmosis. Energy during cell respiration in general will flow like this. We have glucose to NADH to ETC to proton motive force and then to ATP. About 34% of the energy in a glucose molecule is transferred to ATP during cell respiration, which makes about 32 ATP. The rest will be lost as heat. So this is our overview, once again, of cell respiration. Next, let's talk about fermentation. Without oxygen, the electron transport chain cannot operate. So in the case of fermentation or anaerobic respiration, one of those processes will occur after glycolysis to keep being able to produce ATP and free up NAD plus molecules that are required for glycolysis. Anaerobic respiration uses an electron transport chain with something other than oxygen as the final electron acceptor, like sulfate. Fermentation uses substrate level phosphorylation instead of ETC to generate ATP. The downside is we're only generating 2 ATP per glucose as opposed to about 32. So fermentation occurs after glycolysis to regenerate NAD plus so that glycolysis can continue. And there are two types, alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. During alcoholic fermentation, the pyruvate from glycolysis is converted into ethanol in two steps. So first we have the release of CO2 from pyruvate, and then we have the production of NAD plus and ethanol. Alcoholic fermentation is done by yeast and can be used for brewing, winemaking, and baking. And this is a diagram of that process happening. The other type of fermentation is called lactic acid fermentation. Here, pyruvate is reduced by NADH to form NAD plus and lactate. So we have no CO2 being released. This is done by fungi and bacteria, which can be used to make cheese and yogurt. But you also do this too when you have a scarce amount of O2 around. And here is a diagram of that process. When we talk about naming organisms based on the type of respiration that they do, we have obligate anaerobes that only do fermentation or anaerobic respiration, and they also cannot survive in the presence of O2. So there are places on our Earth where these organisms live. All other organisms are called facultative anaerobes, and they can survive using either fermentation or cell respiration. So they may do one or both of those processes depending on what their environmental conditions are like. Final comments, no matter what, we have glucose and glycolysis happens to form pyruvate. And then if no O2 is present, we have fermentation. If O2 is present, we'll go through aerobic respiration where we have the citric acid cycle followed by oxidative phosphorylation.